Hello students, this continues our analysis of Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations. This lecture will cover section 4 of the essay. Now, just as a bit of a reminder, if you remember, we ended chapter 3 with the quote from a Yale president in the 1800s that Coates is using this quote from this Yale president who said that if we as Americans owe a lot of our freedoms and opportunities to the achievements of our ancestors, the patrimony of people who were in this country before us. We also need to accept the debt of those these people did as well. We need to accept the debt of their things they did poorly, as well as accept the things that they did well. And we have to inherit both of them right now and reckon with them as Americans in this country. So, section 4 of the essay picks up from that idea and wants to drive that point home even further, in even more detail. The idea that the ills that slavery frees us from is a concept of how American history and slavery are intertwined, that it is impossible to talk about one without talking about the other, that all of the great things that you might laud about American culture, politics, and history, they can't be separated from the things that are, damaging and harmful, including slavery, racism, and exploitation. So Coates does this in a bunch of ways, and we'll look at them in section 4. First, he starts off with a quote from historian Edmund S. Morgan, who stated that America was founded on ideas of freedom and independence, yet the founders of America either held slaves or were willing to join hands with those who did. So essentially it meant that from the birth of the country, slavery was intertwined within it. So even if somebody had a distaste for slavery or didn't own slavery, that was not enough for them to, as Morgan states, join hands with those that did. So essentially, what Morgan is saying here, and what Coates picks up on, is that meant that America's indispensable working class existed as property beyond the realm of politics, leaving white Americans free to trumpet their love of freedom and democratic values. So the creation of slaves, an indispensable working class viewed as property, allowed Americans of the time, if you think of the 17 and 1800s, to pontificate on American freedom and democracy and democratic values, but they didn't have to extend those to slaves because those were literally not people. So that freed up a lot of smooth theories of democracy. If we look at it this way, it's very easy for me and you to decide how we can work together, especially if we think of a third person whose existence we don't even have to think about in relation to you and I's conversation. All right? Once you add that third person, that becomes tricky. So if you think, the North and the South talking about what exactly counts for freedom or quote-unquote states' rights, all of a sudden, if you just ignore the fact that you had a group of people who existed as property, they don't get a say. Coates says that was tied in with the whole concept of American individualism, American freedom, was built on the fact that it was not extended to a group of people. Right? That it was sort of that they didn't even have to have a say in the discussion because they weren't people. So, continuing on this, what assertion about the rise of racism in America does Coates make in part 4? So, building off that idea that the very founding of America intertwined a system of slavery and racism with American ideals of progress, industry, freedom, and democracy, Coates articulates that for the next 250 years, American law worked to reduce black people to a class of untouchables and raise all white men to the level of citizens. So he makes a note in Section 4 that at the very founding of the country, there were conditions in common between people who might have been in indentured servitude as opposed to slavery. But as the concept of American politics grew, that division became a white and black division. And he proves, one of his proofs for this is a quote from a senator who in 1848 claims, "The two great divisions of society are not the rich and the poor, but the white and the black." So in 1848, this notion that the great division in America was not between class, it was going to be between race. Coates continues, and he quotes David W. Blight, who states, "In 1860, slaves as an asset were worth more than all of America's manufacturing, all of the railroads, all of the productive capacity of the United States put together. Slaves were the single largest, by far, financial asset of property in the entire American economy." So by 1860, owning people was the largest financial asset of property in the entire American economy. So Coates is really aiming here to say that the notion of slavery, and by 1860 in America, slavery was built in as mutually consistent with the rise of American industry, politics, and culture. In fact, it was, as Blight quotes here, the largest financial asset of property. Slaves were a major industry in the United States in 1860. So discussions that you might hear of people talking about states' rights point them to this fact here, that it was a matter of industry. So once again, Coates is showing that as the founding of America, as America's principles were being developed, alongside that was a huge industry of slavery. So the next part of Section 4, Coates goes on to describe a lot of the damages that this huge industry of slavery caused. One of them is the parting of black families. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, keeping families together was nothing that a slave owner was required to do. So you could separate out family, you could sell them, you could sell people, you didn't have to keep family units together. So this parting of black families, Coates describes on page 17, the separation of families as a kind of murder. And he uses that phrase, that the parting of families was a kind of murder, because if you think, try and put yourself in the position of the 1860s, at the time of slavery, record keeping was not as good, communications was not as good, so that when a family was parted, it could be the last time you could ever find that person, the last time you could ever see that person. A common fact about this is when slaves would get married, the traditional marriage statement is till death do you part. They would say till death or absence. So knowing that if you were sold, there was really no chance that you would ever see this family again. So it was like the person who was sold was murdered. They were gone. They were removed from their family and loved ones to most likely never be seen again. So as he brings Section 4 together, and the goal of Section 4 is to show you that the rise of America is inextricably linked to slavery, and that slavery was a damaging and cruel process and a damaging and cruel industry, a huge, massive industry in the founding of America, that you can't deny that the birth of America and slavery are connected. Coates makes this final claim about the impact of slavery. Right? And he talks about the destruction of people here. So in this quote, he's talking about the destruction of families, the destruction of, whatever slave communities were developed. He's talking about that destruction, the destruction of people. The destruction was not incidental to America's rise. It facilitated that rise. By erecting a slave society, America created the economic foundation for its great experiment in democracy. America's indispensable working class existed as property beyond the realm of politics, leaving white Americans free to trumpet their value of love of freedom and democratic values. All right. So he's basically saying that if the building of American culture, the building of American democracy, how we came to America as we know it today, was not incidental to slavery. He's saying that it could not have happened. We would not have America as we know it today without slavery. It was a driving factor in the creation of this country. And so his argument and all of the evidence he provides in section 4 is to drive that point home. That America as we know it was facilitated, as he uses here, by the creation of a working class that was deemed property, i.e. slaves. So, this section, if the end of section 3 ends with a quote that says we need to reckon with the fact that we gain a lot from living in this country, the history of America, the history of American politics and culture and business, that we also need to look at the debts we receive from that. We need to take a hard, cold look at the history as it actually was. Section 4 then gives you a lot of examples and stories and history about what that damage was and how America as we know it could not have happened without the creation of a slave caste. That is the end of section 4. We will pick up our analysis of the case for reparations with section 5.